Strange Detour. Jack Parsons, his world of rockets, the occult, and his influence on NASA. By day, Parsons' unorthodox genius created a solid rocket fuel that helped the Allies win World War II and NASA send a spacecraft to the moon. By night, Parsons called himself the Antichrist when he performed Aleister Crowley's Thelemic rituals to create a new sort of human being that would finally destroy Christianity. I found some very interesting information on Jack Parsons, who was purported to have been a brilliant rocket scientist. I wrote this video according to the two sources I cited in this video, giving them the benefit of the doubt that their information is correct, since it's difficult to verify a lot of it. However, while you are viewing this video series, you will see more than a few hints that the full story about Parsons may not as of yet been written. Therefore, I leave it up to the viewer to decide for themselves as to whether they see the need to go beyond the official narrative of this rather interesting and colorful character. However, the official narrative for Jack Parsons makes for some very interesting viewing on its own, given his influence on rocket science. And as per the quote under this video title, there were two sides to Parsons, his world of rockets by day and his world of the occult by night. In addition, these same people will be surprised to learn that Parsons' passion for rocketry particularly paved the road to rocket technology that is still in use today. This is all the more amazing given that Parsons' formal education was no more than a high school diploma. His theories were incorporated into the overall design of rocket technology in general, which included the Apollo moon missions, all of which went no further than low Earth orbit, if even that, has been established in part 1 of this series, and the Space Shuttle, which was retired in 2011. And in his spare time, Parsons, with an equal amount of passion, studied the world of the occult and the works of the well-known Satanist Aleister Crowley, with whom he maintained a close correspondence. His world of the occult eventually becomes his driving force, which is apparent later on in his career, with many coincidences along the way that seems beyond belief. NASA tends to be hesitant on its recognition of Jack Parsons, presumably due to his unorthodox background and the fact that he wasn't the usual academic or trained scientist. But there is some information about Parsons on the NASA website, though very little, given its contribution to the aerospace industry. NASA tends to be hesitant on its recognition of Jack Parsons, presumably due to his unorthodox background and the fact that he wasn't the usual academic or trained scientist. But Parsons had the look of a man who was easily to have been mistaken for a Hollywood actor rather than the usual look of the serious scientist deep in thought in a classroom or lecture hall writing down equations on a blackboard. Further, it is not often that a man who not only lacked the recognized academic credentials, but was also a passionate pursuer of the occult, would have the influence that he did on the whole world arena of rocket propulsion systems. This included the fact that he not only co-founded the Aerojet Corporation, later named Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but also had a lunar crater named after him. However, as will be discussed, Jack Parsons' world by day would eventually come into contact with his world by night. He would slowly move away from the industry he so passionately devoted most of his career to and immerse himself into the world of the occult with equal passion. Ironically, he would eventually find himself working in the film industry, not as an actor, but in the world of special effects. But as you will learn, both of his worlds would inevitably collide, bringing an instant and early end to the world of Jack Parsons. This is a man who is just now being revered for his contribution to an industry dominated by the appearance of the stereotypical-looking, suited, dark-rimmed glasses academics. History. Jack Parsons was born in Los Angeles on October 2, 1914. Soon afterwards, in 1915, Jack's parents, Marvel and Ruth Parsons, divorced. He saw little of his father in the years to come. This would haunt Jack for the rest of his life, compounded by the fact that he always strived to find that father figure he so longed for. It has often been said that brilliance and genius go hand in hand with emotional turmoil, leading to the complicated, insecure, sometimes intensive and eccentric human being, which aptly describes the brilliant Jack Parsons. After Jack's parents divorced, his mother Ruth had agreed with her wealthy parents, Walter and Carrie Whiteside, that they should live together for the sake of young Jack. The Whitesides moved to Los Angeles and purchased a home in the posh town of Pasadena. Jack was fortunate enough to grow up in a wealthy environment with servants, which gave him plenty of time for his wild and young imagination to flourish. It wasn't long before he came across Jules Verne and his classic book, From the Earth to the Moon. This is a story about a group of American soldiers who designed a plan to send themselves into low Earth orbit and beyond on a journey to orbit the moon. Then the young Jack Parsons eventually found the popular magazine Amazing Stories, which was the first magazine that concentrated solely on space-age fiction. Here we see more than just a hint of how this young Jack Parsons' passion for rocket technology stood out from most children his age. There was a little inspiration in the 1920s and 30s for a child fascinated by rockets to pursue this as a career. In fact, rockets were comic book lore, and although they were written about in some non-fictional articles, they were not considered part of the scientific literature and therefore were not to be taken seriously. Further, that meant that there were no courses on rocket science in the education system available at that time, so there was no guidance for anyone wanting to pursue a path to know what was going on in the aerospace industry. But that didn't deter Parsons with his passion for rockets, as he was already dreaming of interplanetary travel when most children his age were off chasing each other in hide-and-seek games or acting out their favorite movie idols. Individuals like Jack stand out from the rest of us, although to be fair, without the rest of us, there wouldn't be a society for exceptional people to flourish. More often than not, people and women like Parsons usually defy conventional thinking and walk a path to greatness that then leads people to ponder their greatness for centuries to come. We have seen many examples of this in history in areas such as mathematics, physics, philosophy, medicine, both conventional and alternative, and music, including jazz right up to contemporary genres. You occasionally see it in politics, although not as much these days, as the message to anyone who dares to have a mind of their own is usually offered a fact-based report other than the fictional Warren Commission report for their reading entertainment. To add to Parsons' mystic, he was not exactly a stellar student. In fact, he was considered to have been below average by the educational system that more often than not miss the real intelligence and potential in students such as Parsons. The educational system tends to judge intelligence on how well students memorize and regurgitate their answers on paper. It makes one wonder how many seemingly and wrongful labeled unintelligent students have been deprived of their rightful place in history and how society has been cheated out of their brilliance and genius. And to further compound the mystic about Parsons, he was considered to have had a learning disorder. It is now called dyslexia, a disorder that causes the individual to read words in sentences in different orders or to misspell them. Author John Pendle writes, "Throughout his life he would misspell words, and his handwriting in particular, the words usually printed in capitals rather than written in cursive, indicates a learning disorder. At the time, dyslexia was not considered a legitimate complaint, and children who had suffered from it were generally considered to be backwards or stupid. For anyone, let alone such an avid reader as Parsons, the variable grades that resulted from his learning disorder would have only fueled a dislike for establishment education. Thankfully, society has now recognized that dyslexia is no determination of intelligence. In fact, in some cases, people with dyslexia have above-average intelligence and creativity, as was apparent with Jack Parsons. How ironic then that Jack, who was constantly being harassed and bullied in school, would be rescued on one such occasion by a fellow student who himself had dyslexia, Edward Foreman. The two students would soon become lifelong friends and future collaborators in the pursuit of rocket science, producing work that would reverberate for decades to come. If the idea of two people with dyslexia accidentally meeting and then going on to make a major contribution to the aerospace industry seems coincidental, it gets even better. Jack Parsons' World by Day. A well-known rocket scientist by the name of Robert Goddard had started writing his theories down long before Jack Parsons arrived on the scene, notwithstanding the Russians. It would take another book to discuss Goddard's contribution to the world of rocketry. But where Goddard retreated into obscurity after being constantly ridiculed by the media for his theories on rocket science, Parsons was the opposite, who was much more confident, not caring at all about what people or the media had to say about it. Parsons enrolled at Pasadena Junior College, but because of the Great Depression in 1930, their family fortune dwindled, and he was forced to drop out after one term and find work. However, 18-year-old Parsons turned this unfortunate situation into an asset when he found work at the Hercules Powder Company in Los Angeles, which was known as the largest TNT production company for the United States during World War I. It was here that Parsons began to hone his skills in the mixing of propellants that he would incorporate into his theories on rocket propulsion systems in the future. It was here too that he became an expert on chemicals and explosives, two very important aspects of rocket technology. Parsons' friend Ed Foreman also worked at the Hercules Powder Company as an apprentice, and they eventually collaborated on developing rocket technology to the point where their trial-and-error approach to solving problems now required the type of mathematical calculations that they both lacked. Even though Parsons was by no means devoid of mathematical abilities, as his papers with numerous algebraic equations show, he lacked the necessary skills for differential calculus necessary for the complex calculations needed in rocket technology. By chance, a set of circumstances that could only apply to Parsons and Foreman led to a direct connection to the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. Caltech needs no introduction, and a quick Google search will show the many famous scientists who were either students and/or employees there. What's even more amazing is Caltech's acceptance of two seemingly uneducated individuals, Parsons and Foreman, when they casually walked into the preeminent university in 1935 looking for the author of an article on rocket technology published in the Los Angeles Times. It's another example of Parsons' confidence and refusal to be intimidated by the appearance of what many would consider academic men beyond reproach. The author's name of this article was William Bolle. A graduate student in aeronautics, the study of motion in air, named William Bolle had presented a paper at Caltech on the recent work of a member of the Amateur Austrian Society for Rocket Technology, Eugen Sanger. Sanger, who had conducted most of his work apart from the scientific establishment and without any outside funding, spoke in strong optimistic terms about the possibility of rockets being used to power aircraft. What the newspapers were most excited about was the mention of maximum velocities and breaching of the stratosphere. Parsons and Foreman walked right into Bolle's office and introduced themselves, expressing interest in his work. But what Parsons and Foreman really saw in this article was a potential for rockets to be used other than in aircraft. For them, they saw the obvious means of leaving Earth's atmosphere for LEO. It's an example of how Parsons envisioned a future for rockets as compared to his academic contemporaries who lacked the insight of a man like Parsons, going as far as to mock those who even suggested the use of rockets in any other capacity besides aircraft. However, some of that mocking behavior from his peers would turn out to be justified given the present state of NASA's non-existent manned launch capabilities to LEO, which is no fault of the brilliant Parsons. Bolle was busy with his own research unrelated to rockets, but was impressed enough upon meeting Parsons and Foreman for the first time to recommend them to a graduate student named Frank Molina. It was this introduction that formed the team of Parsons, Foreman, and Molina. Frank Molina had studied mechanical engineering and had an interest in interplanetary spaceflight. However, at the time of meeting Parsons and Foreman at Caltech, he was working at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, GALCET, specifically in the wind tunnel experimenting with scale models designed for aircraft submitted by several aviation companies. But he was so impressed with Parsons and Foreman's work that he immediately saw the possibilities, which rekindled his own passion for rockets. Since the 1930s was a time when rockets were not a part of any academic curriculum, this meant, of course, that there were no scientists trained in any aspects of rocketry, or better put, there were no rocket scientists as of yet. Rockets were only taken seriously when seen on the big screen alongside Buck Rogers. This is all the more remarkable when considering the future achievement of Parsons, who had little or no more than a high school education, whose work would be credited with solving problems that eventually contributed to the success of the Space Shuttle program. But at the time, Frank Molina clearly saw Parsons' potential regardless of his lack of academic credentials. Pendle quotes Frank Molina as saying, "It seems to me that at most he had finished high school. When I met him, he already had a certain amount of experience with the manufacturing of explosives, but I think what was outstanding about him was that he was not of any fixed view on which way to go. He had a very flexible sort of attitude." Soon, Parsons and Foreman would be working alongside the university-educated Molina at Galset, and in the process, the team acquired its skills for differential calculus. And this flexible sort of attitude would soon lead Parsons and his newfound team, aptly called the Suicide Squad, due to their experiments and the occasional explosions that would reverberate throughout Caltech, on a path that would bring innovative technologies for the future of the aerospace industry. These technologies were then incorporated by an industry that would benefit most from Parsons' brilliance, even more so than the manned space program, that of the military-industrial complex. Parsons, Foreman, and Molina would go on to influence the aerospace industry for decades to come. The Suicide Squad. Although the Suicide Squad would add their own members, Parsons, Foreman, and Molina would be the foundation of this team. And now Parsons and Foreman had access to Galset, a remarkable and unheard-of achievement despite of the fact that these two seemingly uneducated members literally walked into Caltech from the street. This meant that they had access to the laboratory's equipment regardless of the fact that Parsons and Foreman were not even students, let alone formal employees of one of the most revered academic institutions in the United States. However, they soon developed a not-so-flattering reputation through their laboratory work, which was compounded by their lack of formal education. They would never be fully accepted as equals into the perfect world of Caltech, despite their obvious brilliance and their eventual acceptance by the scientific community in general. Note: this is one of several red flags to the official narrative regarding Jack Parsons. There are many examples of formerly uneducated but very intelligent individuals who have been written about in history. But few of those individuals have literally walked into a prestigious academic institution such as Caltech, only then to be accepted as faculty members. However, in another of many ironies with Parsons, it wasn't his achievement in rocket technology that gave him the much-needed acceptance and recognition he deserved. It was his participation as an explosives expert at a car bombing trial reported in the media at that time, in which his testimony won the prosecution its case against the defendant, Los Angeles Police Captain Earl Kinetti, who was eventually sentenced to San Quentin prison. It was considered a sensational news story at that time, with Parsons as the prosecutor's star witness, impressing everyone in the courtroom with both his brilliance and charm as reported by the media. Parsons, Foreman, and Molina went on to continue their research, apparently impressing almost anyone that they came in contact with. But what eluded them was the means of getting their work the wide attention and recognition it so deserved. They finally found their path not in terms of launching rockets, but in how useful rockets would be in military aircraft. Frank Molina had traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with the National Academy of Science, NAS, Committee on Army Air Corps Research to make a proposal to study jet-assisted takeoff, JATO, for aircraft. As you no doubt noticed, jet had now replaced rockets, given the mocking behavior of the scientific community when the mention of the word rocket was used. He explained to NAS the potential for jets to boost overall aircraft performance in takeoffs, speed, and range. The NAS was impressed enough to give Parsons' Suicide Squad $1,000 to prepare a proposal. After they submitted their paper to NASA, they were impressed enough to increase their budget to $10,000. However, there were serious problems with the combustion of solid fuels, or more specifically, the black powder used in rockets, which proved to be unstable, somewhat difficult to what was discussed in Part 1 of this series with the liquid-fueled F1 engines. In that case, it was the ineffective cooling systems which caused combustion chamber instabilities. The propellant itself was apparently stable, and there is no comparison in metal rockets with a length of 2 feet with the complexity of a 9-ton F1 rocket engine in the Saturn V, in which its combustion chamber instability problems were never solved and was therefore discontinued after the fake Apollo Moon program, which ended in 1972. Parsons consulted with some of the best minds in the business, but to no avail. However, a renowned scientist at Caltech, Dr. Theodore von Karman, devised 4 differential equations to determine if the process of restricted burning powder was stable in solid fuel rockets. He then gave the equation to Molina, who studied them and made the determination that the process was indeed stable. Pendle writes, Molina eventually emerged triumphant. Karman's equations had proved that the process was inherently stable. Parsons just needed to find the right combustion of ingredients to create a fuel of suitable strength capable of uniform burning. After Karman's equations proved solid fuel rockets were possible, Parsons continued his work even more motivated than before. By this time, he then moved their work to a more secure area away from Caltech, leasing 6 acres of land in Arroyo Seco from the city of Pasadena. Parsons spent the next several months laboring over powder formulations and numerous testing of rockets to find a solid fuel mixture that would sustain a controlled burn. Parsons eventually solved the problem when he devised his own black powder propellant. With this new powder propellant, Parsons was then able to accomplish for the first time a controlled and steady burn in a rocket. With the success of experimenting with rockets and boosting the overall power output of the aircraft, the NASA increased their funding to $22,000, which then increased to $125,000 the following year. Clearly, the NASA was impressed with the potential possibilities of Parsons and his team's work. All of this work by the Suicide Squad led to their first contract, which was to produce 60 JATOs for the Army Air Corps. This meant that these jets had to perform to near perfection with the accepted reliability to go with it. Further, World War II had broken out, so the Air Force was now requesting even more powerful JATOs to assist heavy-loaded aircraft in takeoffs from aircraft carriers. In order to help fulfill this military contract, Parsons and Molina decided to form a company in 1942 called Aerojet Engineering Corporation. This eventually led to a $3 million contract, an impressive amount of money for that era, to produce guided missiles with a range of 150 miles and a payload of around 1,000 pounds of explosives. And given the significance of the work Parsons and his Suicide Squad were doing, along with the fear of Nazi involvement in their own rocket program, this now required all of the members to undergo FBI security checks. Given the increasing demands of military contracts, Aerojet Engineering Corporation was reorganized and became the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. Again, the use of the word rocket was avoided for fear that the company wouldn't have been taken seriously. But before JPL could fulfill their new multi-million-dollar military contract, it was necessary for them to solve one more problem with these rockets, a problem that would be solved by another member of the team who had the inspiration and ingenuity to do so, Jack Parsons. Because of the ammonium nitrate used in the propellant mixtures, black powder rockets were prone to unexpected explosions brought on by temperature changes. So, Parsons had to devise a method to prevent these unexpected explosions from happening. Then he came up with a brilliant idea. The consensus of how Parsons solved the problem was that he was inspired when he happened to observe workmen pouring asphalt on a roof. This caused him to remember a method first used 1,500 years ago, but was famously used in 648 to 685 AD by the Byzantine Empire and their use of a liquid flaming weapon. Theories of its ingredients included asphalt. Parsons' idea in solving the problem of using black powder was not to use it at all. Pendle writes, "He made up for his lack of theoretical and mathematical schooling with his prestigious memory, broad experimental knowledge, and most importantly, his ability not to be dissuaded by conventional thought. Black powder would never be a suitable rocket fuel, but the armed forces wanted a solid-fueled JATO. When is a solid fuel not a fuel? It was a question that Parsons answered with an Archimedean Eureka! As Melina affirmed, it seemed that suddenly, as if by addition of some ingenious ingredient, all of the various stuff that was in the back of Jack's mind gelled. Parsons replaced black powder with asphalt after hundreds of years of an established method, making them stable and reliable. In essence, Parsons rewrote the book on solid fuel rockets and is a method that is still used today. Once again, Jack Parsons refused to allow himself to be restricted by any preconceived notions, including an education system that more often than not promotes a consensus, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, there are occasions when a consensus has been proven wrong by individuals who have had the insight and have refused to allow themselves to be governed by a set of rules. Thanks to Parsons' work, solid fuel boosters were used to successfully launch the Space Shuttle for 30 years. Parsons and his team now concentrated on the area of liquid fuel rockets and were faced with similar instability problems experienced with solid fuel rockets. They needed to find a stable liquid fuel. There were pros and cons to using both solid fuel and liquid fuel rockets. However, when solid fuel rockets are ignited, they cannot be shut down, so they burn until their fuel runs out. But liquid fuel rockets were considered more practical since, unlike solid fuel rockets, they can be shut down at any time. Parsons' work had proved essential in the design and engineering of future weapon systems and rocket technologies in general. Most notably, his inventions included the solid fuel boosters used to help launch the Space Shuttle to LEO. These accomplishments to the aerospace industry are all the more amazing when you consider Parsons' passion for a darker and more sinister world. This will be discussed next. Jack Parsons' World by Night. For many people, the attraction to the occult by a rocket scientist is contrary to the logical and studious academic whose only interest should be reading, researching, and doing scientific experiments. It is a community of trained scientists who present themselves as society's sober second thought, logic being their only trait, or at least, that is how they like to be portrayed. Yet, how disturbing it is for many people, especially among scientists from all backgrounds, to find out that one of the most innovative and revered rocket scientists of the 20th century, whose theories have been instrumental in the Space Shuttle program and military ballistic missiles, would be a devout occultist, going so far as to practice the very satanic rituals most people would be horrified by. But that is exactly who Jack Parsons was, filled with as much passion for the occult as he was with his work in the field of rocket science. But to gain some understanding of Parsons' attraction to the occult, it is necessary to at least briefly discuss one of the occult's revered and infamous leaders, Aleister Crowley, to whom Parsons corresponded with on a regular basis. Aleister Crowley, the Great Beast. For many people, Aleister Crowley is a man who needs no introduction. He was revered, despised, and/or feared, depending on your disposition to him. He was also one of the world's most infamous Satanists whose admirers and followers included celebrities, top rock musicians including the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, the power elite of British society, and of course, one very innovative rocket scientist, Jack Parsons. It is intriguing to see the world from Parsons' perspective while appreciating his enormous contribution to the world of rocket science and the influence he had with the aerospace industry. He is an example of how scientists and aerospace engineers are subject to the same kind of influence as everyone else, whether that is religion, culture, books, movies, the occult. The list is long, including an admiration for Aleister Crowley, aka the Great Beast. As particular as it may seem, the influence Aleister Crowley had on Parsons may have influenced his push for more powerful rocket systems. His work was being used in propulsion methods on various weapon systems, which are now standard in the military-industrial complex. In part, the military-industrial complex is the area where Parsons' true legacy lies. That is not to say that Parsons deliberately set out to harm humanity, and in fact, he may have thought that he was doing a noble service, or one can assume. But nonetheless, most would agree that his desire to follow a man who called himself Baphomet, Frater Perdurabo, the Master Theorin, 666, and the Great Beast definitely has some influence on his work. Pendle writes, "A novelist, poet, philosopher, mountaineer, chess master, painter, big game hunter, but above all, magician, Crowley was born in England in 1875 into a wealthy but austere religious family. As a child, he was allowed to read only the Bible. It did not convince him. He grew up to rail furiously against both the British prudery and his strictness of Orthodox religion, proudly positioning himself in the direct opposition to God and the established Christian Church. To this end, he identified himself with the Great Beast from the Book of Revelation."